Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from the Wide Left Substack. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, quick question, because you watch a lot more WNBA than I do. If you take 5 steps and then get fouled, is it a foul or is it a travel? I'm confused as to why things ended the way they did.
Well, what a fascinating question. Luckily, the esteemed refs that adjudicate the WNBA have answered this for you, which is that I don't know why you mentioned those steps at all. That's weird. Where did that come from? Definitely foul.
Even under review?
Okay, so again, the refs have done a really great job of answering this question. The review is only to confirm what you already knew, so it doesn't actually change things.
Oh, okay. Wow, that seems...
I am so heated about that. We'll do that after the intro.
We've got a WNBA question in the mailbag. We'll do
Perfect.
it there. Yeah, that was interesting. We did get a question at one point that asked, at what point will we have an NFL coach go after the refs in the Super Bowl the way that the Lynx coach did? And I don't know that you'll ever see that. I'm baiting him right now. I'm baiting you so hard.
We are reserving the WNBA stuff for the WNBA question.
I'm really trying right now. He's just going to be fuming all the way through the Lions review. It's going to be great. Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well. The Vikings lost this weekend in what felt like a playoff game. What felt absolutely like we might see each other a third time this year sort of game. The Vikings lost. It was a last-second kick by the rookie, ? From the Lions. Would you call him a rookie or would you call him a UFL legend?
He is a Central Arkansas soccer legend. No, I don't think he's a rookie because he was an undrafted free agent in 2023, so you can't really call him a rookie.
Well, we can call him a UFL legend, and the man hit the kick. Good for him. And the Lions were able to escape Minneapolis with a victory. But we're licking their wounds a little bit. It was a fun game to watch. We will be covering that here in just a moment. We also have a discussion on Tua coming back and what all that means, and a little bit of a discussion on what you can expect and what you can't expect from the Guardian helmets. That as far as that is concerned, and concussions. We also will be going over the mailbag as well. But before we start, again, thank you so much for listening to Norse Code. If you enjoy the show and would like to help us out financially, there's a couple of things you could do for us. You can go over to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there for $3.50 a month, or a little less for the year subscription. You get access to the Discord, bonus material, all of that. New bonus episodes should be coming out here later this week. Actually, no, it'll be coming out this weekend, because we're going to be doing something special for later this week with the show. So expect it later this weekend, and that will be happening. But a special thank you to what I could only describe as a series of numbers is what you'd put in for your username that signed up over on Patreon. Thank you so much for signing up. I'm not going to repeat the numbers in case this is your phone number or something or whatever, but thank you so much.
Activate the sleeper code.
When I say the numbers aloud, it's just meant to cause the Winter Soldier to come out, and I don't need to have that on my conscience again. So we're going to ignore that and just thank you so much for signing up. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and get any number of wonderful pieces of Norse Code merchandise, including shirts, hats, baby onesies, shower curtains, all of that over at norsecode.threadless.com. And a special thank you to the Union 32 Craft House, who will be hosting us on December 12th. Eagan, Minnesota will be giving away 2 tickets to the Chicago Bears Vikings Monday night game. So that is the plan for December 12th. Come out, please. We'll have lots of fun. We'll be giving away some stuff. I'll make sure that we have enough speakers so that everyone can hear us. Last time we had it in there, we were not expecting a full house, and that's what we got. So we will be planning accordingly. So please come out December 12th, Union 32 Craft House. It is the Thursday night before the Monday night game against the Bears. Let's get into the review of the Lions game. This was a game where the Lions took the lead. And I say that because the Vikings had only been, behind for a few minutes in the very beginning of the season. But otherwise, that was about it. So I guess we can talk from there. How do you feel like the Vikings played when they were behind?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of like a question that a bunch of commentators had. I think even Bill Belichick mentioned it, either on the Pat McAfee show or some other appearance. He's been everywhere, about kind of the question mark that you have about this undefeated team. Can they play while they're behind? For the most part, I think that they had acquitted themselves well. Now, it doesn't help that once they went behind even further to be 2 scores behind for the first time this season. In fact, the only time they were behind, I think, was at the very beginning of the season. It was 1 score to the Giants for 4 minutes. So this was the first time they were behind by 2 scores. I think mostly they did a really good job. I actually think that the Vikings generally played very well. There's some stuff that we have to talk about that are concerns going forward. They're not, a perfect team. They're not an elite team or anything like that. And, there are reasons why that's the case. So obviously there's elements for why they lost. But I think that generally the Vikings did a pretty good job of kind of adapting to that situation. They didn't press, when they were behind. They didn't start throwing the ball crazily and try to get more deep downfield shots than they usually do. They were still capable and willing to run the ball with an effective run game, and just kind of manage the situation as if there wasn't time pressure on them to score, which there wasn't until late. And so for the most part, I thought that they did a pretty good job handling that. Again, obviously the defense needed to play better. Would have been nice if Darnold didn't throw that pick, etc. The real concern is just kind of what happened in the final 2-minute drive, which we can talk about when we get there. But for the most part, I think that the Vikings did a pretty good job handling that situation, which actually, that didn't really concern me. A lot of people brought it up. It didn't strike me as something that was a genuine criticism, and I think that kind of bore out. I don't think the Vikings played any worse because they happened to be 2 scores behind for the first time.
If I could, I'd like to compare and contrast a bit between something that we just watched this evening and the play that we saw on Sunday from Sam Darnold. If we could compare I don't know if you would call it the play selection or just the aggressiveness that was happening between Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield that was happening tonight, where Baker looked like every throw was a panic. Everything seemed really rushed and really he was making it more difficult for himself by the end of it, as opposed to Sam Darnold, who still appeared to be collected and things. Yeah,
and I think that collected is not a way that you would describe Sam Darnold throughout most of his career. But with the Vikings, he will do wild stuff all the time. Okay, fine. But I don't think he panics. I think those are kind of different things. And, Baker was panicking a little bit, which, fair enough. He kept losing receivers, kind of like clockwork until the very end.
God, yeah. And by the end, everyone was just going through the motions of that game. After Godwin went out,
it was okay.
Yeah.
All right. We had our charade of trying to mount a comeback down 10 with 1 minute left, and now it's haunting us. We don't need to do this. It seems pretty clear Godwin's going to be out for the season, right? Whenever the truck just decides they're not going to play the replay,
yeah,
okay. And then I did watch the replay because I was like, oh, okay. Well, I didn't actually see it because I was typing, so I scroll back in my YouTube TV. And I watch him there's a reason they didn't do that. I didn't want to see that. That's bad. He's out. He's done. Rough showing. But yeah, so he started panicking as a result of that. Incidentally, Tristan Wirfs got his first holding penalty for the first time in 3-4 years, something like that. And Darnold is kind of a different character, right? Like when he's wild, it's because that's kind of the way that he thinks and not because he's panicking. And you can kind of tell that it's like a pretty measured, way to go about chaos. If there's a way, if there's like a way to frame that. And I think that that's what kind of helped the Vikings. I think that the fact that they didn't panic when they were down by multiple scores is like the reason that they were able to pull within and make it so that, they got the lead at the end, and then, very suddenly again, they didn't. But yeah, I think Darnold played some really good football. Again, you don't want the pick, and you don't want what happened on that final, I said 2-minute, 15-second drive. I thought that was really poorly managed. But for most of it was a better game than he had in the previous 2 games, and those were wins. So really good performance, I think, overall.
They just announced that Godwin dislocated his ankle.
But that's better than break, because that's kind of what it looked like.
Oh, that's still...
Oh, it's bad.
Oof.
It's still bad. But, there's like... We're dealing with like horrific and bad, right? And you wanted bad. It's kind of like voting, if I may get on my soapbox.
You lose Mike Evans, you lose Chris Godwin, and just sit there and go, well, I guess we're going to be losing a tiebreaker to the Falcons by the end of the year. Fantastic.
We're going to be losing a Todd Bowles by the end of the year. That's what's happening.
That's too bad. Well, let's get into the game. The Vikings were able to have a quick start thanks to the defense making a big stop and sniffing out a fake punt that it seemed like everyone in the world knew was coming. And Minnesota was able to stop that.
Yeah, I commend them for, because it was like, what, 4th and 7, if I remember correctly. Like, it's kind of a weird spot to do the fake punt. But, it's the Lions, and so I was glad that they had kind of kept their wits about them and were on the lookout for it. It was a speed option fake punt, which, what? I've never seen that in my life. And despite the fact that that's a pretty rare way to do a really rare play, the Vikings were like really assignment sound. They had somebody on the pitch man. That's wild that the special teamers were like, that's the pitch man. I got to cover him. I can't go after the ball. Otherwise that's going to break open the whole play. And they did it. They killed the pitch, and then they got to the ball carrier. They had 2 people on the pitch man. What the world? That's mostly because the blocks kind of fell apart. I think it was like Jeff Schwartz on Twitter who's like, this is what happens when you run speed option with people who don't block speed option for a living. Fair enough. But yeah, that was a really great way to start things. And I think, a couple of people were like, hey, the Lions are going to do some crazy stuff at the beginning of the game, and that's going to basically decide the game. That didn't, but had the Vikings won, that would have felt like a turning point.
Yeah, this was a great way for the Vikings to start, and Aaron Jones was having a great time out there for a little while. Good for him. Aaron Jones played. Aaron Jones had been kind of questionable over the past few days, and it looked like he was going to go. His hip wasn't going to bother him, and had some success out there, so good for him. I guess I want to ask where the other wide receivers were this game outside of Jefferson and potentially Naylor.
Well, I think, the other receivers actually did really well. So Jefferson, obviously he got 81 yards on 8 targets. Naylor got 76 yards. Addison got 66. That's like a pretty good spread. Addison, of course, had the 51-yard gain. That wasn't, I wouldn't say the game was like out of hand or anything like that. Obviously, the Vikings pulled within the lead in the final moments before losing. So it's not as if it was out of hand, but the Vikings were down by a pretty significant margin at that point, and they were able to craft a 51-yarder to Addison. Other than that, of course, he was relatively quiet, right? 66 yards, 51 of them coming on one play. But I mean, that's kind of who he is. He's like kind of volatile. Like he's, in like your fantasy leagues, he's like, the boom bust guy that you kind of play if you're already an underdog and you just kind of need a lot of points, 0 points or 50 points, right? And yeah, I think that's kind of reminiscent of what we saw. I think Naylor still is the more reliable receiver of the two in terms of getting open on like traditional receiving concepts. But yeah, I don't actually think that there was a huge issue with that. I would say that like if TJ Hawkinson had been ready to go, and there was a lot of indication that he probably would be, obviously that didn't happen. In fact, I was 0 for 2 on figuring out whether or not Aaron Jones and TJ Hawkinson were going to play. But and that might have been the difference. It was like a 2-point game, right? So I think that could have been the difference, right? But I think, for the most part, I don't want to take away from Naylor or Addison, who I thought both had really good games.
Well, can we talk about the offensive line and specifically Ed Ingram?
Yes. I think that this was not, by any reasonable stretch of the imagination, Ed Ingram's worst game. I think that actually he was mostly fine until that final moment. Of the 5 offensive linemen, he was the worst, right? But someone has to be, and that's like literally that's the only way I would want to characterize his game up until that moment. Like it really, honestly, was not a bad game from him. The Darisaw had an outstanding, crazy good game. Brian O'Neill had a very good game. He was like kind of losing off the snap a little bit, but he would always recover and maintain a clean pocket. I mean, the Vikings, until like very late in the game, were giving up a pressure rate of like 19%. It was crazy. And then when they started giving up that pressure rate that was a little bit higher, Sam Darnold's holding onto the ball a lot longer. You take a look at this is so annoying. So in the box score, they say that Sam Darnold took 4 sacks. He did not. He took 3 sacks. The play-by-play says he took 4 sacks. He did not. He took 3 sacks. One of them, he scrambles forward for a yard. And the thing is, if the refs didn't decide that and decided to spot it as a run for no gain or a sack for 0 yards, that would have been fine. I actually would have just been like, all right, well, that's how it happens. You get weird spots. But that's not what happened. The refs actually spotted the ball a yard ahead of where the previous line of scrimmage was. And so it was 2nd and 7, and then it was 3rd and 6. And you take a look at the broadcast, it is 6 yards from where the ball is placed to where the down marker is. 6 yards. And it's right on the yard line. It's unambiguous. It's 6 yards. But the play-by-play and the score bug both say 3rd and 7, which then makes it a sack for 0 yards. I'm actually very annoyed by that. Other than that, Sam Darnold had like 4 scrambles for 39 yards. Holy crap. He had 3 first downs on those 4 scrambles, or 3 first downs on 5 scrambles for 40 yards. But either way, that's what the pressures were. They were either the 1 interception, 7 completions, 5 scrambles, or 3 sacks. That's all the pressures turned into, which means that there were 4 negative plays on those pressures. Like it was a really remarkable performance from Darnold against pressure. Again, you don't want to throw the pick. But, for the most part, there wasn't a ton of pressure until very late in the game. And that's when it's like an obvious passing situation. They're teeing off and sending extra. They don't have to worry about the run and stuff like that. Okay. That's when pressure rates are going to increase. But it still was like the second least pressured game that Darnold's had, and he still held onto the ball a fairly long amount of time. Now, the reason people are mad at Ingram is because on the final play, which was a sack, he doesn't pick up somebody who ends up being the person that sacks Darnold, and he probably should have been the one because of the way you see the line sliding. The line slides right, and that means that Ingram has to take the second rightmost player, and he doesn't. He takes the third rightmost player. Bradbury notices, and he's like kind of panicking. He's like, whoa, you gotta, oh God. And now he has to like do stuff, and it's not working. So that was a huge problem. It led to the sack. Other than that, I don't know. Like you take a look at some of these other sacks. One of them, Darnold holds onto the ball for like 4 whole seconds before he scrambles, and that's where the pressure comes, and then that turns into a sack. On another sack, it looks kind of like there's pressure coming off of Brian O'Neill. Now, he eventually recovers, but I don't think you can fault Darnold for sensing pressure and responding to it, because at the time, it very much looks like the edge rusher has a straight line to him. In either instance, that happens after the 2.5 second mark. So I actually think the offensive line did an incredible job. But the final box score and the pressure percentages and stuff like that will not make it look like that. One of the sacks was on, it looked like a naked bootleg. Greg Olsen said after the play that it looked like they were trying to get Garrett Bradbury out to block an edge rusher, which seems like a really difficult ask. He didn't do it, and so that ends up as a sack. To me, that looks like a naked bootleg. Now, I don't think Olsen's wrong. What I'm saying is, like, in terms of assigning blame and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think mostly the offensive line was actually pretty good. And Ed Ingram was the least good. But if I were to say, make a case for Dalton Risner starting over Ed Ingram, I don't think this game would be a ton of evidence. I think, like, you could bring up this final play, sure, but it would have to be part of a pattern that had been established in the previous 5 games, honestly. So, yeah, sure, Ed Ingram did a disappointing thing. That level of play is not something that I wouldn't expect from a starting guard. Like, that game just wasn't bad for him, honestly.
Well, let's look at the defense, because it appeared as if the more you blitzed Jared Goff, the better he played. And that's a terrifying concept.
Kind of. I think that's what it felt like. I don't think that's what happened. I think that he was robotic. I think he was good regardless of whether or not the blitz arrived or not. What's interesting is if you take a look at the blitz versus non-blitz numbers, he was slightly better in terms of yards per attempt when the Vikings didn't blitz. Now, PFF gave him a worse grade against the blitz than in a clean pocket. And I think that's because they adjudicated that he had 2 turnover-worthy plays against the blitz, which maybe, and in that case, actually blitzing was better. But the larger point I want to make is that it seems like marginal. Like, yeah, he got a higher yards per attempt when he wasn't blitzing, but it seems like there was basically no difference. And so, I mean, he was just kind of powering through it. He kind of knew what the answers to the blitz should have been. Didn't always get the time to execute them, but when he did, pretty big gains. Honestly, it doesn't seem like the Vikings' decision to blitz a lot, I think, had a huge impact on the outcome of the game, because when the Vikings weren't blitzing, Goff was doing even more damage. The Vikings blitzed at a season high rate, I think, in this game, like 59%, most they have all season. And obviously you look at that and then you see that Goff had this incredible game. It's the best game a quarterback has had against the Vikings this year. And you might think those two are related, but they're really not. I mean, he was just carving up the Vikings no matter what they did. So I don't think it's about a decision to blitz or not blitz. I think that there's something more fundamental to the way the Vikings play defense, as well as some of the talent that they have at cornerback that has to do like with the coverages that was the bigger problem. I thought, a high blitz plan, that's probably fine because it's what the team's comfortable with, and it didn't look like it created new opportunities for Goff. Now, like you're correct that Goff took the blitz apart. It's just he took the not blitz apart too, and he did a slightly better job taking the not blitz apart than the blitz apart, if that makes sense.
It does, and it was just, I'm not entirely sure when the step up for Goff really happened, but this was Terminator style play. Like, this was the single digits number of incompletions. He was a machine out there. This is everything that we had kind of been warned about as far as, Detroit's going to be really good this year and their offense is really good. Side note, one of their wide receivers just got popped for PEDs, but he was somebody who did not accomplish anything on Sunday.
Yeah, -4 yards.
Yeah, so -4 yards.
They waited to announce the suspension. Yeah,
-4 yards, PEDs. That's 2 games for you, bud. I like to think
could have been 4, but we saw what you did.
Yeah, so. I feel like that weighed in on the number of games. Between that and the betting thing, boy, he's Jameson Williams is having a year. Yeah. But yeah, this was everything that we had come to expect as from being told all off season and all regular season. Like, there is an offensive juggernaut happening in Detroit, and you better get ready for it. And they'd gone to Dallas and beat them within an inch of their lives, and came to Minnesota, and Minnesota kept it close.
Yeah. They did a much better job than Dallas did. For sure. Yeah, I mean, like you said, single digit number of incompletions, 3 of them, along with 2 touchdowns. Like the touchdown number was rivaling the incompletion number. That's insane. The Vikings probably did more damage in the fact that they had created more sacks than there were incompletions. They had 4 sacks, which I think is the most he's taken this year. I can do a quick look on that. But yeah, I mean, when they didn't bring him down, he was just completing. He was just completing passes. Yeah, it's the most number of sacks he took this year. I mean, I guess he took more against the Seahawks when he went 18 for 18. So his incompletions actually were just he had a higher percentage of sacks in that game, but he had fewer total sacks because they only dropped back to pass 21 times. Yeah, Yeah, I don't know. He just took them apart. He just kind of knew where his answers needed to be. He got rid of the ball in 2.52 seconds. 15 first downs on 25 attempts, 22 completions, 0 throwaways. I think 2 of his 3 incompletions were like batted at the line of scrimmage. Like not even they didn't even impact his accuracy really, right? Like if you take away spikes and batted passes and passes that are throwaways and stuff like that, he went 22 for 23, right? Like, I think he might be second in the league this year in completion percentage behind, I think, was it Jaden Daniels of all people? But he's number 1 this month. And it's not these like short, dinky, like Bo Nix style high completion rate offenses. It's like he's pushing the ball, right? Like he's making difficult throws. His completion percentage over expected is like the best in the league because of how much he's pushing the ball. It's not, a deep throwing offense. The average depth of target in this game was 7.6 yards downfield. That's slightly below the NFL average, which, I mean, that's not a criticism. That's just like, it's not as if he's completing 50-yard bombs every single play, just a couple of plays. But yeah, I mean, yeah, he really dismantled the Vikings. This is going to be one where they have to kind of figure out how exactly they got unraveled and do something about it because, I mean, he's great. I mean, right now, like, I think he's the NFC Offensive Player of the Month, which puts 2 in the division after 2 months. And obviously there's like more to play until that happens, but like he's probably in the MVP race. You can't really, until his play falters, you can't really take that away from him. But this has been a really good month, and the Vikings were unfortunately part of that really good month.
And if you're looking at how they were scoring, Minnesota had been allowing touchdowns, but only in the red zone. These were outside of the red zone by some distance. These were big plays that the Vikings hadn't given up this year.
Yeah, I mean, on throws over 20 yards, he was 3 for 3 for 82 yards and a touchdown. So it's a big play there. And then I think the other touchdown was a shorter pass, but I think that one was like Yak, if I remember correctly. But yeah, like the Vikings were giving up plays that ended up as scores that were much further downfield than we're used to seeing. And it just kept on giving up big plays that we're just not used to seeing, period. Like it kind of reminded me of how the Vikings scored against the Packers, where they got like guys open on double moves and stuff like that. And you're like, oh, okay, he's just open, I guess, touchdown. And that didn't happen against the Vikings all that much. It was just the Vikings doing it to other people, and now they're kind of receiving it. Yeah, I mean, when they meet again, and this time it'll be at Ford Field, which is unfortunate, they're going to have to just hope that Goff isn't as on. I think that's part of it. But they're going to have to figure out kind of what solutions the Lions stumbled on, which we've got a piece over at Wide Left that Luke wrote about kind of the primary solution that both the Packers and the Lions were exploiting a lot that they will have to get into. Luke's been ranting about it a ton, so you've probably, if you follow him, already know that it's the dagger concept. There's a lot that he wrote about it, so that's worth looking into. But even outside of that, even if you take away the fact that he went 5 for 5 on the dagger concept, I mean, he still went like 17 for 20, right? Like that's pretty bad. So yeah, I think that there's like a lot that the Vikings need to cover up, but you can't ignore the fact that the Lions were just playing really outstanding football at the same time.
And they were, and it was just difficult to sit and watch and wonder where the hell the corners were, or why the safety was where he was, where like Harrison Smith or whatever, why the safeties were where they were at. He was just taking us apart.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, Cameron Bynum did have a genuinely bad game. That's like part of it. And he was actually responsible in the catch and run for the touchdown, I think. Or no, he was responsible for the Amon-Ra touchdown. And then he was responsible for the rushing touchdown later. That was it. The one where Byron Murphy was in coverage was really, it's on Cameron Bynum. I think it's more on the scheme than it's on Cameron Bynum. I made my case for that on the Minnesota Football Party. It was basically impossible for Bynum to do what he needed to do, and Murphy was just playing catch up, so it's not really Murphy's fault. But yeah, it was a combination of they had the right answers, and Stephon Gilmore trips, and suddenly that's a big gain. Cameron Bynum's out of position, that's a big gain. He misses a tackle, that's a huge gain on the ground. Yeah, I mean, the Vikings are going to need more out of some of their best players, and Bynum is maybe not like their best player, but he's one of the talented players that they've been really excited about for a couple of years, so you just can't have games like that.
And there was a discussion about why the Vikings were able to get to Goff 4 times for sacks. There was a discussion why it felt like the Vikings were maybe not getting to him as often as they should have, or making it look like, because we've got that rookie that's been playing out there that really hasn't been making that much of a difference. It feels like it should have been that they should have been able to get to him more based on just how often they were able to blitz or sending 6.
Yeah, I think, like, abstractly, you take a look at what the Vikings did to him in terms of pressure, and he was pressured on 58.6% of his dropbacks. That's crazy. Like, again, 40% is about the line where quarterbacks begin to like fall apart and their play just doesn't work and they're just not having a good time. Having a bad time, actually. 60%, 58.6% is an absolutely crazy nuts number to have pressures on. And then you get 4 sacks on that. And so genuinely, the Vikings did get good pressure, but they actually also blitzed at the same rate, 58.6%. And so you would hope that they have a high pressure rate because a lot of those are coming on 4-person rushes, right? So you want those blitzes to come home a lot more often than they did. And again, the Vikings gave up fewer yards per attempt when they were blitzing than when they were not blitzing. So it's not as if the blitzes didn't have an impact, but you would kind of want, because those sacks primarily came on non-blitzed rushes. Like 3 of his 4 sacks came when they were rushing 4, right? So it really feels like the blitzes weren't doing much. They kind of were. They were creating pressure. He was just kind of powering through them. So, the Vikings had an outstanding pressure rate in this game. They had a pretty good sack rate, 23.5% of pressures turned into sacks. And they did make Goff more uncomfortable when they blitzed, but it didn't come together at all. Goff played, he threw for 12 yards an attempt while pressured. What do you do at that point? That's like part of it is that I think the defensive line and the pressure, I think all of that basically did their job. But the problem is when you put them in these positions where there's only 4, 5, maybe 6 players in coverage and the rest are rushing the passer. When you put them in those situations, you have to do better than average, right? Better than average is not your mark anymore. You can't have 6 rushing 6, when they keep a running back or a tight end in protection. You can't have 6 rushing 6 and then no one win. That's like the last thing that can happen because then it's a touchdown. So it's always higher stakes when the Vikings do this. And for the most part, they've answered the bell. They've answered the call really well in those situations. But it really puts the onus on that pressure group, whoever's blitzing and whoever's rushing, to do more and to have better than just an average performance or an above average performance. So I do want to say, a lot of the issue was really in the back end. in, with the cornerbacks and with the safeties and their coverage. But those issues appear because they do get hung out to dry a little bit. But it's not as if there wasn't any pressure. So how much? But like it's just kind of tough to navigate it all. And at some point, you just have to say, well, I don't know. Jared Goff just played probably the best game I've ever seen him play. That includes the Seattle game, by the way, the 18 for 292 yards. I don't know. This might have been the best game that Jared Goff has played that I've seen. There's probably better games that he's played, especially against the Vikings in a Rams uniform, right? But 60% pressure rate, he's completing 85% of his passes in that scenario. Like, Jesus, like, I don't know what you're supposed to do.
Well, let's talk about how the Vikings didn't give up, because when there was 28-23, Josh Metellus was able to get the ball out of David Montgomery's hands. Fumble was recovered by Ivan Pace and returned for the scoop and score touchdown, which put the Vikings in a really great spot. And then they couldn't seal the deal. They couldn't finish the game on offense, and instead had to rely on their, let's just call it, poor 2-minute defense. And whether it's the end of the second quarter or the end of the game, the 2-minute defense is abysmal.
I don't get it. Like, it's so bad. It's so bad. 8 plays for 44 yards to set up a 44-yard field goal. Like, they even had, like, relatively, because they put the Lions on the 26, I think, right? So they had, like, relatively good field position to kind of start that drive. They put the Lions on the 30. They finished at the 26. Relatively decent field position. But this was like, obviously they had 4 touchdown drives in a row. So those were worse drives to give up. But this was like just like a wild thing when you're supposed to kind of have the clock on your side and the Lions are just playing around with it. Now, Greg Olsen was wrong when he was like, why aren't they hurrying up? Like, no, the Lions are very deliberately executing this so that they've got control of the clock and the timeouts when they want to. And they're going to have to spend time earlier in the drive to drain the clock if they want this to be the last possession. And obviously it turned out really well. So Greg Olsen was wrong about that. But when that happens and you're winning and they're draining the clock, like you're a point ahead and they're draining the clock, I don't know, it's like go time, right? Like you got to make sure that these third downs don't convert. Like, I don't know what else to say. But yeah, I mean, the 2-minute defense collapsed yet again. I don't want to suggest that this is like a persistent problem, because the other instances where the 2-minute defense collapsed, it kind of didn't matter. They were much more concerned about the clock. And so they turned 2-score games into 1-score games twice, once against San Francisco, once against Green Bay. But those weren't real. The Jets one was real, but they did actually perform at the very end. So you didn't have to worry about that one. And this one was the most real because they lost, right? And so I think it's pretty clear that however they're managing these end-of-game drives, they have to have a different approach or a different philosophy. And it kind of reminds me of the Brian Flores stuff in Miami, where, and by reminds me, I don't mean it's the same thing, right? It could be literally the opposite thing, and we learned the wrong lessons from Miami, which is that he was getting castigated for calling cover 0 when a lot of people would call prevent, because, and his reasoning was, this is how we got here. This is why the defense is good. We're going to keep calling the plays that have made us good. And that time they got burned. I think it was it against the Jets or whatever? Anyway, everyone accused them of tanking. He pushed back on it. And it turns out everyone was right. The Dolphins were trying to tank and he wasn't letting them, right? Like, it's kind of a weird situation. But calling cover 0 was not actually an example of him attempting to tank. It was him staying true to his defense. Now, it very much seems like the Vikings are not staying true to their defense. It feels like he maybe learned a lesson, maybe the wrong lesson from all of that. But whatever it is, they're giving up way too much at the end of games. It's getting way too close. And so something has to occur. Now, the issue here is that a traditional 2-minute defense, you're in coverage a lot. You're sending guys a little bit deeper, right? And you had people make miscues against San Francisco, right? I think Harrison Smith was a big one in coverage, but they started this drive with, I want to say 3 straight runs. Like, yeah, they had an idea of what they wanted to do. And the Vikings, I think, were just expecting passes, because that second run that goes for 14 yards. or is it the third run? Whatever it is. I think that they were expecting only deep stuff, and there was stuff underneath and run stuff that really didn't like I don't think they understood that like these chunk gains will set them up for a field goal. I think that they were doing a great job preventing a touchdown that no one was attempting. And so that has to get figured out. I think that is actually, I'm not going to say it comes prior to this dagger route problem. Maybe it doesn't, but it's at or near that priority level where it's like, we got to figure out why we're not closing out games the way we want to. Again, some of that 2-minute stuff is like fake-ish because Green Bay and San Francisco. But like, the Jets shouldn't have gotten to the position where they did before, Gilmore got the pick, right? This time they didn't get the pick. So now what? Now I think you got to stop trying to bend but not break. I think you got to push back a little bit sooner. You've got to play like you've been doing for most of the game. And I don't mean calling the same plays because the offense is not calling the same plays, but rather playing to the level that you did for most of the game. So that to me is probably the second weakness of this defense. The first one being the very specific schematic one that Luke identifies. The second one being, hey, I think you're playing the clock and the coverage wrong every time, every single time, all the time. Don't do that.
And it's incredibly frustrating because I feel like we've been watching it all season. And and you were right, like the Jets game, that interception was there, but we shouldn't have had to like be at that point. Like Aaron Rodgers just like picked it apart, and it just so happened that he made a mistake because he doesn't have anyone to throw to, except for now Devontae Adams, who's a better tackle than he is a wide receiver. Based on the game on Sunday night. But that's the thing, is that you can't just say, oh yeah, we'll get a turnover on the final drive. No, you won't. That's not usually how that works.
Yeah. You have to stop drawing comparisons to the 2016 Vikings. You can't just get turnovers in the final drive. You can't manufacture that. You got to think about that like you got bailed out against the Jets. Like that's the way that they have to understand that framing, is that you got bailed out. You shouldn't have gotten to the place where you were. And obviously I don't want to say it in a way that takes away from what Gilmore did, which is understanding that this was going to be a back shoulder fade and anticipating it and getting to the ball well before, I think it was Mike Williams was the intended receiver, well before Mike Williams could get to it. That's not going to happen every time. Mike Williams has been so bad for the Jets and or so bad for chemistry with Aaron Rodgers. Really depends on how you think of it. But whatever it is, that connection has been not working so much that this guy is going to get traded. Like that, you can't rely on the quarterback throwing to a guy he wants to get rid of every single time late in games. I don't think that guy exists on the Lions, right? Like it's not going to exist in the playoffs.
Well, I mean, maybe if he does exist, he's on a 2-game suspension now.
Man, -4 yards and then a 2-game suspension. That's rough, dude. It's entirely his fault. Like I'm not sympathizing. That's just it's a lot to go through, man. But yeah, I figured out. I don't know. Like if you're so the back end of the defense is very simple. The front end of the defense is very complicated. That's how it works. That's how it's winning. If that can't last into the 2-minute situation, right? And I'm including all 2 minutes, like 40 seconds left, 1 minute, 40 left. The point is the clock is a factor and they're trying to score and they're behind, right? If you can't convert that into a 2-minute, then that's just like a fundamental flaw with the way that the defense is constructed. And we can't pretend it's the best defense in the NFL or whatever. You just can't have moments where it's like, yeah, well, so long as you're close until the final minute, you've got a great shot. Well, if you've got that great of a shot, probably you don't want to live there.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, that's got to be figured out.
I don't think this phrase has ever been associated with the Vikings before, and if it has, apologies. But I feel like the phrase "fat cats get slaughtered" really applies to this team.
That's a pretty unique one. I don't know where you came up with that.
God, I must be some sort of a genius. I feel like there's ways to illustrate this point. If only I had stuffed animals and knives.
Right, yeah, like you'd probably want some sort of visual representation of cats, and it doesn't have to be cats as long as it evokes the idea of cats, and they'd have to be slaughtered, and you don't want to bring actual animals in, so Yeah, a replacement like stuffed animals. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe even make some shirts.
Yeah, that's what we need. We need shirts that remind people that fat cats get slaughtered. I'm trying to think of any other parallels we could get to that season. Good lord. Yeah, so this game happened, and we've got plenty more in the mailbag as well. But to me, I feel like it proved a couple of things. One, that this team is actually for real. The Vikings went up against one of the best teams in the NFC, and they were in it the whole time. And they were down a bit. They rallied. The defense picked them up. Offense couldn't finish the job, but this was a great heavyweight bout. And looking at the numbers, it was very similar. I think it also showed that Detroit is going to be there in at the very end of the year. Like, Detroit is going to be like the final boss that we may have to go through here. I'm not looking at the rest of the NFC. Things are interesting, but Detroit is definitely going to be there. But the rest of the country got a real good look based on the map of where the game was airing. The rest of the country got a real good look at, no, Minnesota is actually for real, and there's some good stuff happening here. They just need to figure a few important things out, like how not to let scores happen so damn quick at the end of quarters.
Yeah, I mean, it was a game where a bunch of people were punching each other on the mouths. It was great, right? Like, I think I tweeted near the beginning of the game that this was going to be a great game after a couple of big plays had occurred. And, a couple of people after the Vikings lost were like, it looks like you were wrong. And it's like, no, I'm not. That game ruled.
That game was awesome. Like, it sucked that it ended and they lost, but like, that game ruled.
Yeah, it was one of the better games of football we've seen this year, right?
We didn't lose by 40. That was great.
Yeah. I mean, like, Dallas wishes, right? I mean, it was a good back and forth. And the Vikings, like, I don't think there was a sense, except among the Vikings fan base of all people, I don't think there was much of a sense that many people thought that this Vikings team was fraudulent, right? Like, I think when a lot of teams surprise you, there is a sense that the surprising team is fraudulent in some way. But I don't think a lot of people actually thought that. They were watching this team and they were like, oh my God, Darnold's playing out of his mind. This defense is, bananas. I don't think anyone really thought that the Vikings were, resting on their laurels or benefiting from a ton of luck. And it just didn't seem like Fugazi, right?
It was more like they were waiting for Darnold to turn into a pumpkin.
Yeah, which still hasn't happened. The closest it's happened, of course, was not this week, but last week. And whatever, right? But yeah, and it was nice to kind of affirm the people's belief in the Vikings, even if they didn't come away with the win, right? Which is that Darnold can play some really outstanding football. Again, I thought he played really well in this game, right? The defense can compete with some, like, the Vikings had the top running defense by any metric that you can come up with that could reasonably be used to measure a running defense. Total rushing yards, yards per carry given up, yards, or expected points total given up, expected points per play given up. No matter what success rate, they had the best. Like, no matter big play rate, they had the best running defense in the NFL. But a lot of people correctly pointed out that no one was running on the Vikings because they were all scrambling to come back from 2-score deficits, which is maybe the best example of the argument you could use for, we don't know if the Vikings can actually do this the other way around when they've got the 2-score deficit. Maybe. But, the Vikings faced the least amount of rush attempts, both in total and, or rather I should say per game and in percentage of plays, because teams are throwing the ball all the time in order to catch up. Okay. Well, now you've got a team that is probably going to be running the ball if they're 2 scores down, which didn't happen in this game. They're always going to be running the ball. And the Vikings really, I mean, this is the worst rushing game the Detroit Lions have had. Certainly this season, I want to say in 2 seasons, if you include the Montgomery fumble, right, in terms of EPA per play. So it was like negative 11 EPA total, the worst EPA per play that they've had all year by a significant margin. If you get rid of the turnover, right, if you just count the turnover as just like a normal, like before you get to the negative 7 points added by the picks, by the scoop and score, It's still the worst EPA per play game that they've had all year. By success rate, by far the worst success rate that they've had all year. The Vikings did a great job defending the run. Now, obviously, Jared Goff having like a nearly perfect or actually perfect passer rating, they got to do a better job there, right? But I think for the most part, the Vikings kind of demonstrated that they have the goods, and for them to be able to take on one of the favorites to be in the Super Bowl this year and play them until there was 15 seconds left in the game. Yeah, I mean, it's a good demonstration that this team is really high quality. That said, a couple of things they could have fixed, and maybe they would have come away with a win. That also, I don't know, like the Lions might be the best team in the NFC now because the Eagles are fake, the 49ers are all hurt. Yeah, but also when they were healthy, it wasn't working. Yeah. The Seahawks are obviously frauds. The Cowboys are fraudulent frauds.
They are trash. They are secretly fake. Bad.
The Commanders are like good, but I don't think they're as good as the Lions. Also, they're the Commanders. You kind of expect the bottom to fall out,
and
right?
Tampa Bay no longer has receivers.
Yeah, that's gone. So
you got Falcons? Like,
yeah, it's the Lions. Yeah.
So we've got all that. Let's go to our next topic, which is going to be a little bit of on Tua, who has come out today in a presser saying that likely he'll be playing here for the game on Sunday. Also, he has no current plans to wear the Guardian cap on top of his helmet, despite his series of concussions. It is worth noting that he already does wear a helmet that is designed to cut down on concussions, but there was a big argument online as to whether or not he should be wearing the Guardian cap as well. In fact, I had mentioned it right after that injury on the show that I'm not sure I ever want to see him play without a Guardian cap. But there's been a big argument online about whether he should, whether he shouldn't, and what we even know about Guardian caps to begin with.
Yeah, so this bothered me a lot. So I hadn't actually looked into Guardian caps a ton. I kind of assumed that they were effective because it seems intuitive that they would be. And then the NFL touted their effectiveness. And actually, their manufacturers' claims dominate the search rankings. So if you look up Guardian cap effectiveness, using a normal Google search, you'll find some really, really positive numbers. So when Tua said that he wasn't going to do it for personal reasons, right? Or it was a personal choice or whatever, people got really mad at him. And I personally am upset by the decision that Tua made to continue playing football. Like, it is out of line for me to discuss his choice, probably. Certainly Mike McDaniel thinks so, right? He absolutely thinks it's out of line for me to discuss it. But whatever. My opinion, as it relates to kind of this particular situation, is that he has an obligation to his loved ones to stop playing, as well as an obligation to himself, right? And I think it's the obligation to others, as well as the internal competitive drive, that will drive athletes to make these decisions. Because I think a lot of people think of athletes as being stupid and being selfish, and I think that that's not really what's happening here. And because of that, I wanted to resist the idea that this was an example of an athlete being stupid and selfish, right? Primarily, this kind of stuff is driven, in my experience, I haven't done a survey or a study, I can't prove it, but in my experience, it's primarily driven by a desire not to let your teammates down. And I wanted to respect that. So with all of that, I wanted to look into Guardian caps because he just said no, and he's got this terrifying history of concussions, one that he has taken seriously in some capacity, because I know that he opted for a new helmet, which I will talk about, and he's also opted for movement training, specifically judo, which I think I talked about on this podcast, as I thought was actually an excellent move. Sports like Aikido and judo that involve a lot of throws also do a really good job of teaching you how to protect your head and creating an instinct that will protect your head from injury as you go to the ground instinctively, right? It creates a set of habits and movement patterns through the training that will move you to do stuff that will protect your head. And it's those movement patterns that will probably do more than any single piece of equipment that he's going to be wearing. And so the things that I wanted to talk about here are, one, the people that are criticizing Tua, and he's just getting pilloried for this. He's getting absolutely demolished on this one. The people that are criticizing him for it just assume that the Guardian caps help reduce concussion incidents. So I wanted to look that up, if there have been any studies on that at all. And the great news is there have been a decent amount of studies. None of them, 0 of them, suggest that they reduce the likelihood of concussions. And what's even more interesting is that they don't even reduce, in all likelihood, something that doesn't even relate to concussions, but is more related to what helmets generally do, which I'll talk about, which is the speed of deceleration, which is what an impact is, right? Like, the reason you wear a seatbelt is because it slows your deceleration in a car crash, whereas you will rapidly decelerate against the windshield if you're not wearing a seatbelt, right? And that's what kills you. It's the same thing with a lot of injuries. Rapid deceleration is force. That's going to cause injury. Whereas less rapid deceleration is what helps. The Guardian caps in a lot of lab testing don't do that at all. They have done some real world testing involving college athletes in various testing environments. They've done it at Stanford. They've done it in a couple of other NCAA environments. And they have found no change in the impact and the acceleration. There was one test where they found a reduction in a particular impact metric. So I do want to mention that. But for the most part, a number of these studies have found no difference in the impact and acceleration, which is not even the mechanism that causes the concussion. Now, obviously, an impact has to occur, right? But that's not the mechanism. The mechanism is your brain sloshing around inside your skull and hitting your skull. It's the secondary impact that causes the concussion. And no helmet's going to stop that. And in fact, if you take a look at what helmets do and do not do, helmets generally do not prevent concussions. They just don't. They prevent a bunch of injuries to your head that are related to that primary impact, but they do not really reduce the incidence of concussions. Now, some helmets are purpose-built to reduce concussions. Those are, and I promise you, different than these other helmets. Like, it is not necessarily marketing pablum that some helmets will reduce concussions more. There's a reason that they will. One of the helmets, or rather one family of helmets that has done the best in the testing that we have available to us for this kind of thing, it's the VC's family of helmets. They started with like version 1 or 01, which I kind of hate the model name, but whatever, back in 2016. And it's kind of like how you design cars. It's collapsible. It's meant to collapse instead of remain rigid like most helmets are. Because most helmets are designed after like motorcycle helmets, which are designed to prevent skull fractures. These do a very good job preventing skull fractures, but they don't do a very good job preventing concussions because they don't distribute the force and allow it to like relieve in some way. And so these helmets collapse, and that reduces concussion incidents because that first impact doesn't really get to your brain, and it doesn't make your brain slosh around in your skull. Now, it's not going to eliminate concussions, but it is going to reduce concussion incidents. And from what I've seen from independent testing, not a company's claim or the NFL's claim or the NFLPA's claim, which I'm beginning to not love all of the NFLPA's approach to some of these studies, is that it will reduce concussion incidents. Now, there's 5 different types of VCs. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing. Is it VICIS? Whatever. I've only ever read it. There's 5 types, but they're all specific to the position that you play. And they collapse in different ways based off of the most likely types of impacts that you'll receive. And obviously Tua has the quarterback version of this. Now, there's 2 other things I want to add to this. One is, okay, so the evidence that we have suggests that there's no impact, but it couldn't hurt, right? It's more padding. And I sympathize with that, but I've got like a couple of responses to that. The first is, if there is no evidence that something will help after it's been studied at least a little bit, I think I don't think couldn't hurt is a bad approach, by the way. I don't think it necessarily is. I'll push back on it in a second. I don't think it's a bad approach, but I do think it is enough for you not to scold someone for not using it, right? Like, why isn't Tua doing this? It couldn't hurt is a garbage argument, and also a bad reason to suggest that an athlete is doing something that's going to harm themselves. I think it's ridiculous to scold an athlete for refusing to do something which there's no evidence for. Which I'm going to talk about the analog there as well. The second thing is manufacturers of helmets since 1996 have revoked their warranty if you modify the helmet in its operation in any way for good reason, right? Because they don't know how these interact with the helmets in the normal operation. And the ruling was by the kind of the committee that handles helmet ratings and certifications is that the third party helmet thing, the addendum, has to take on the warranty. But now these helmets are no longer liable. Okay. We don't know what the impact of these Guardian caps could be that are potentially negative. And there's a couple that I thought of, and one that I didn't think of until a little bit later when I was talking about these collapsible helmets to someone else a couple hours ago, which is the one is that a couple of years ago, there was a push for soft shell helmets, and players rejected it and people rejected it because it increased the amount of friction on those helmets, and it was likely to create torsion and potentially create additional impact on like your neck. And that is in fact something that they're still studying when teams go from the normal glossy helmets to the really wicked awesome matte helmets that I love. That's a material difference, and it increases the friction on that helmet. And the studies have indicated that that increase in friction does have a demonstrable effect on the forces applied to the head and the neck. That's a concern. So you're adding nylon or some other material that's softer and more likely to be gripped, accidentally or on purpose, that could impact the movement of your head in ways that you don't want, that could lead to neck injury. Okay, so it's not just a couldn't hurt, it could hurt. The second thing that I didn't really think of too much until I was looking at these helmets more is that when you take a look at these helmets, like, you know, Nick and Joey Bosa wear them. And I know when we watch Nick Bosa, his helmet looks really weird. It's really distinctive. Patrick Mahomes wears it. We saw Patrick Mahomes' helmet just kind of break one day. Like, I remember a game where it just like broke. I think Arpit Sports did a really great thing on it. That was a good thing, by the way, because it's a collapsible helmet. It was supposed to do that. It was cold, so it broke instead of collapsing, but that's still better. So long as you replace it. And obviously Tua wears it. A bunch of players wear it. You take a look at these helmets and there's all of these little vents. That's so that you can change the shape of the helmet without changing the inner layer and that impacting the athlete. You can't have it be airtight in the middle. Otherwise, the gas is going to compress and then that force is going to come out on the other side. It's going to do the same thing. So these vents have to exist. And while I don't think that these caps are airtight or anything like that, I think it's unlikely because they're foam. They have to be able to compress. I think it is a reasonable concern that this could impact the airflow of a collapsing helmet as the air vents out. It could actually make things worse. And I think it's ridiculous that people just assume that these things are good because the NFL says they're good. The manufacturer says they reduce concussions. They've never published that data. The NFL says that after practices, they found it reduced concussions. They've never published that data. And I think, I just don't trust the NFL. I certainly don't trust manufacturers' claims. But I don't trust the NFL when they make these very visible changes that they don't publish the studies on that make it look like they're doing something to improve player safety. Because they only care if it looks like they're doing something to improve player safety, not if they actually are. So I don't know, when it comes to this sort of technology, we're so easily bamboozled, right? By a new innovation that intuitively feels like it's going to work, when really there's all kinds of questions that we're not answering that could make things worse. And one of the reasons that I've been so annoyed about, the pandemic and, the vaccine stuff is that it makes it look ridiculous when a player says it's my personal choice, or it makes it look ridiculous when I say it's actually pretty reasonable to do something that there's no to not do something where there's no benefit to your health, because it sounds a lot like what people said during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I guess is still active, right? No one's acting like it. and reasons why people don't take vaccines, when that's actually not the case. And we had all kinds of evidence for why this would work. And, all of these studies were not accelerated, but they were overlapping on top of each other in terms of phases. So people thought they were accelerating, but there were actually really good data backing them up, and people just didn't accept it. And so it sounds like you are a vaccine truther when you say that there's no medical benefit to this new technology that purports to help you. And someone uses a very valid response, my personal choice, that happened to not be valid during a contagion where your personal choice does not impact more than it bothers me so much that people are like, oh, there's COVID deniers agreeing with Arif. And that bothers me too, by the way. I hate that, but that's a totally different thing. And someone else is like, well, I mean, might as well take the seatbelts and airbags out of your car. That's not the same thing at all. The amount of evidence that we have that seatbelts and airbags help is so beyond robust that calling it robust is an insult to the treasure trove of data we have about how much it helps. So, I don't know. It's like the way that people talk about this stuff really impacts our ability to correctly make these kinds of decisions. And the Tua Tagovailoa stuff is like a perfect example. The discussion should not be focused on whether or not he wears a friggin' Guardian cap. It should be whether he's fulfilling his obligations to his loved ones by continuing to play football.
So before we go to the mailbag, we like to do on the Monday night podcast, we like to talk about what we learned this week, and we can add the discussion on Tua's helmet to that as well. But there's a couple of things that I know I learned this week, and we can start with what happened with the Bucs here and their lack of receivers. They are screwed, despite their ridiculously easy schedule after the bye in a couple weeks. The Bucs are not in any good shape to be dealing with anyone. Actually, they've got 3 games that are going to be difficult, and then they have their bye, and then they start playing all the powder puffs. They start playing in addition to they get the Panthers, they get who else?
They'll probably still beat the Panthers if we're being honest.
Well, but yes, they'll beat the Panthers, but this changes. But yeah,
they've got the Raiders, the Chargers, who the heck are the Cowboys, the Saints. Yeah. Oh man.
The over-aggressive attempt to get to get within 3 points
to finish the game within 1 score.
Yeah, that may have destroyed their season, and that is that's fun.
Yeah. So my understanding is that Mike Evans was already banged up by the time he took the injury that brought him out of the game entirely.
Yep.
So that's a problem, that you did not manage this player's health well enough that he was unlikely to get injured, which is, again, the reason that you wouldn't play like TJ Hawkinson in this game. You have to understand how hurt your player is and how that's going to impact their likelihood of injury going forward. So that happens. And then the Chris Godwin thing happens because you're extending a game unnecessarily. I do get why you would continue to attempt to play genuine football when there's 1 minute left and you're down 10. Right? It feels like you can map out the scenario for which you can force overtime or something like that. I get it. Don't. Just don't.
You got your one onside kick. Just leave it alone.
Right. So now we're going to figure out whether or not Sterling Shepard's revival is real. It's not. Well, okay. As a third receiver, he's playing really well.
Yeah,
and that's it.
Well,
I do not trust this guy.
Step up
against friggin' Sauce Gardner or whoever he's. I mean, he's not good up against Sauce Gardner, but you know what I mean. Against the cornerback ones of the league.
Yeah,
right.
Well, start running wind sprints. You're now wide receiver 1.
It's him and Jalen McMillan who had a brutal drop, and a bunch of guys that maybe they'd wish hadn't cut on other teams right now. It's like they got Ryan Miller on the practice squad, Marquez Callaway. This is brutal. They're done, dude. You might have one guy cover 2 of these receivers and you might be fine. It is brutal. The Bucs are done. So we got that going for us.
Yeah. Bucs are, so the Bucs are done. Another thing that I learned this week is I already knew that Stephon Diggs was an important level of petty. He may be the most petty individual in the entire league right now that's not a quarterback for the Jets. That
quote rules. They ask so he has an altercation with Jair Alexander, who he's become very familiar with over the years, before the Houston Texans game against the Packers, right? And they ask him about that altercation, and God, this is so funny. I was walking to the locker room at the beginning of the game, and I heard somebody chirping. I'm never the bigger person. I ain't letting it go. I'm never the bigger person is such a quote, dude. It's so good. It's like, yeah, I'm 30. I know who I am at this point.
Yeah, it's like I am self-aware enough to figure out by now that's not me. I will use this as fuel. I will do something in pregame that a lot of players get ejected for. Let's be honest.
Yeah, right. I'm never the bigger person. I mean, like, I wish he'd like backed it up with kind of more going on in this. It's weird because he had like 5 catches, and you're like, oh, 5 catches, that's not bad. How many did he have? Like 80 yards, 23 yards. I wish he had backed it up with a little bit more. Mind you, he was second on the team in receiving. Dalton Schultz had more with 28 yards, but it was a bad day for the Texans, really. But or Texans passing game, I should say. But yeah, that's so funny, dude. That's so funny.
Yeah, that was entertaining. And while we're discussing former Vikings receivers, KJ Osborne is having some problems out in New England, as any wide receiver would be having problems out in New England. That team is, depending on the week, either the second or the third worst team in the league. And sometimes it manages to be the first. And,
yeah.
Ugh.
The thing is, like, even as that's happening, even as they're, like, switching to, a new quarterback, it's always really tough, and he's a rookie. Even as they're doing that, and he posted, like, this long thing on, was it Instagram stories? Something
yes,
like that?
It was on Instagram.
He posted like this thing, like someone sent him a message. I'm so proud of you. You did all this great stuff.
I'm so proud of you because you went from being inactive Wednesday and only taking 3 reps all week in practice to being told you're activated at 11 p.m. on Saturday night. You go in to the game at another position across the world in London, and you held your composure. You did what a pro does. Yeah. The whole thing, and he's clearly just, he needs to get out of there.
Yeah, well, and so like a teammate also posted something. Like, let me take a look at this. Like Jalen Polk, I think, posted something that kind of got at it. Let's see where I can find it. Here it is. Where is it? So Jalen Polk left with an injury. He posted a cryptic message to Instagram involving he had an emoji of a hand making the peace sign. So everything is looking great for New England and the receiver group. They're all wide receiver posting, which is a bad sign.
Yeah.
If all your wide receivers are wide receiver posting, you're in hell.
That wide receiver room is just like reading Nietzsche, and that's it.
Right. Yeah.
Somebody's got Dante's Inferno.
They're reading like variant translations of the Bible. Like, you're cooked.
they're just chanting. Everyone in that wide receiver room is just chanting.
But like the thing is, like, there are people eating in this offense, right? Like Hunter Henry is eating. Demario Douglas is kind of eating. Jalen Polk, despite what he had posted, is kind of eating a little bit under Drake May. KJ Osborne is not. And that's got to feel weird because when he signed with New England, he must have thought, well, there's nobody here. By default, I should be starting.
Yeah,
I think, which is fair.
This is the Adam Thielen situation. Why am I not wide receiver 1?
Yeah, right. Like obviously, right? But yeah, it is a wide receiver room full of wide receivers, and I mean that with all of the attendant problems that comes with.
Yeah,
not a single tight end or running back in that wide receiver group. It is brutal. And
apparently, JJ McCarthy can tweet or post on Instagram like a wide receiver too. So that's another terrifying aspect.
But his are cryptic, but they're never they're never
dangerous.
passive aggressive, right? Like the wide receiver cryptic posts are just like, there are enemies all around us, and I am ever vigilant. And JJ McCarthy is not posting like a quarterback does, or rather he's posting like a Hieronymus Bosch painting version of a quarterback, where it's like eventually you get to the God is great part of the post, but you have to like work your way into it and kind of squint. And yeah, he's like, the stars in heaven have arrayed for this particular path, and you're like, oh my God, it's a wide receiver post, I'm screwed. and he's like, yeah, and that's wonderful, and I'm where I need to be. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's a kind of strange way to say that.
Yeah, we'll take it. It's a little odd, but sure.
Yeah, so we're in an odd place with McCarthy and his posting, but certainly we're not in, a snake lies in the grass as you step a foot or whatever, right? Like you're not wide receiver posting.
No. The other thing I learned this week is that the Jets need to get off of my primetime TV.
Absolutely,
I'm sick of it. I have watched too much Jets this year. They're not good. They were not going to be good this year. Everyone involved with the decision to put the Jets on so many times this year needs to be fired, possibly out of a cannon. I am sick of it, and we've got 2 more left. According to the schedule, we've got, they've got the, on Halloween, that Thursday night,
That's apropos, I guess.
They are playing the Texans. And then they are a 3:25 game against the Cardinals. So that'll be, it's not like prime time, but it's later. And then they've got a Sunday night game against the Colts on the 17th of November. You couldn't pay me to watch that. That is awful. Why do I have to watch? And it's versus.
We got to stop putting the Colts in prime time, by the way.
Yeah, the fact that they're playing the Vikings in prime time too is fantastic. I think that's wonderful. I think Anthony Rich, he's gonna have, it'll be fun. But just the Jets they're probably not gonna make the playoffs. If they do, they're the final wild card spot. But
right. And it's because what everyone expected at the beginning of the season, that the AFC is weak.
Just the 2 sweetest words in the English language: default. They get the last spot into the in the wild card. But this team is the defense had moments against the Vikings, but it's not, the defense isn't good. Breece Hall, bless his heart, is not doing it. Aaron Rodgers has these brief moments where he is absolutely in control of everything and can drop it within a penny, like within just a micron of where he wants it to go, and it's beautiful. And every other throw is awful.
And then the 20 other throws.
Oh my God, they some of them are should not be shown to children. They will terrify them. Like, it is so bad. And
the Roger Sherman tweet, just one more Aaron Rodgers friend and the Jets will figure it all out. I swear they're so close. They just need one more Aaron Rodgers friend. They just need one more Aaron Rodgers. And everything will click. Just one more Aaron Rodgers friend, please. They only need one more.
And I joked about Devontae Adams being a better tackler or corner, but he didn't. It was his first game in, and the first ball just doesn't work to him. That was
funny.
Oh, I got laughed hard. But watching Devontae Adams lose to the Steelers for the second time in 7 days. And watching him...
Yeah, Devontae Adams went from a 2-5 team that just lost to the Steelers to a 2-5 team that just lost to the Steelers. That's got to be insane, dude.
Watching him run down that interception, oh my God. And stopping the score. But watching him run that down, oh, it blows your mind. This is what you came to New Jersey for, huh? This is it. I'm not even saying New York. You don't play in New York. You play in New Jersey. Which, fine, we have New Jersey listeners. We appreciate you. You play in New Jersey. You are... your team is terrible, and you should feel terrible. And I'm tired of watching you on my primetime evenings.
What's funny is that it was the same rookie that intercepted Aaron Rodgers twice. Just some rookie, dude.
And what was great is I had the game on, but I had it muted because I had the 3 screens up. I had the I had the basketball, I had a WNBA final game up, I had baseball, and I had this. So I was able to like kind of ignore it enough, but still watch Aaron Rodgers like overthrow receivers by a week and a half. Like that was at least like a nice aspect of it.
Yeah, that's like a pleasant experience.
But I've watched too much Jets. No one should be exposed to the Jets this often. This is why all Jets fans are weird. Because they have this much exposure to the Jets. It's not good.
It's got to be weird to have to like go through this experience of like suffering the Jets and being a Jets fan. And then also everyone, when you say the words Jets fan, everyone thinks of Fireman Ed. And like that's also a burden you have to carry.
you carry the Fireman Ed. Oh. Well, there was that story about how they're trying to phase me out. Wasn't there a thing where he had like retired?
Yeah, no, he quit the team. He was mad.
He quit the team.
He's like, I'm retiring Fireman Ed. And then like, I think it was Aaron Rodgers that was like, oh well, they got Aaron Rodgers. I'm coming back.
Sometime shortly, sometime between the firing of Rex Ryan and Geno Smith, he decided he was done, and
he'd had enough.
I get it, dude. I get it. And then now he's back and said, "Oh, they don't want me part of the team." It's like, yeah, you should go home.
It's fine.
Get off of this narcotic. There's no good here to deal with. Well, let's go to the mailbag, and the first question is from JT O'Brien, who asks, "Long time, first time for a Reefs debate yourself corner. Should Vikings fans be discouraged or encouraged about the Lions game? I'll hang up and listen."
Okay, yeah. No, I mean, obviously the Vikings fans should be completely discouraged by the Lions game. I mean, the first time the Vikings go up against a team that's at full health, that is one of the elites, that has the ability to actually identify what kind of defense the Vikings are running, that has met them once before, of course they turn into dust. You take a look at the way that they dissected that Vikings defense, found all of the weaknesses, as Luke Braun would say, found dagger, found the exact same passing concept 10 times in the game in order to scorch them for over 100 yards in just one passing concept alone. That creates the blueprint for all these other teams. I mean, it is a defense that is designed to stop one offense in the NFL. One offense is the Shanahan-McVay offense. How many of those outside of the Matt Stafford Rams have actually won the Super Bowl? It's been the Chiefs, right? And that's a different West Coast. We're stopping the wrong offense, right? It's all these offenses that people fall in love with, and finally you get an offensive coordinator that can run his own offense and they fall apart. All of these other teams are going to take that as the blueprint and take apart this defense. And it's really the only thing that's keeping this team together, because the Vikings obviously haven't demonstrated that they can play from behind. And so once the defense is solved, they're going to be playing from behind for most of these games, and they don't have the ability to pass the ball when the threat of the run isn't there. We saw what happened when Aaron Jones went out. The running game died. The passing game died. You only had to rely on a lucky pick from Stephon Gilmore against Mike Williams, who's about to be traded, for you to actually end up in a position where you could win against the lowly Jets, who are right now struggling to exist, like we just talked about. Of course, the Vikings should be Vikings fans should be in purgatory. They should be wondering where their team is. We've seen the Vikings go out to 5-0 leads multiple times before they collapse. This is just another example of them doing that. Last year, we saw what happens when the Vikings defense gets game planned for, when people figure it out, when people have determined, oh my God, they're actually running a zone behind that blitz. How innovative that is to take an idea from one of the worst teams in the FBS in college football and decide, hey, this is going to be our defense. And when it finally gets figured out, they get eviscerated for the worst points per game at the end of the year last year. And now we're seeing what happens when a team that's already played that defense once gets to play them again. Guess what happens in the playoffs? You're going to be playing all these teams again. They've already been exposed to your defense. That novelty is gone, and you're done for. And the person that you're going to turn to at the end of the day when that novelty is gone is Sam Darnold. So that's that. But on the other side of that, right? I think that whoever thinks that is a moron. I cannot believe that you take a look at one game, think that the defense is solved, especially when the defense already ran. It's not like they gave up 31 points and that's it. They ran back another 6, failed the 2-point conversion, which is on the offense, not the defense. They scratched back 6 of those points. Holding a team to a net of 23 points is actually really good if they're the top offense in the NFL, which guess what? The Lions are. You're allowed to lose by 2 points against the best team in your conference. That stuff happens. guess what happens when you repeat your schedule? You have the ability to go up against them again and see what figured out. Jared Goff is on an insane heater that he's not going to be able to sustain. Right now, he's completing like 88, 89% of his passes. We've all seen Jared Goff go on streaks before. Guess what? We saw it when his name was Kirk Cousins. This just happens sometimes when you've got a guy get hot for a month and he has the best passer rating in the NFL because he's throwing to these phenomenal yak merchants that have the ability to turn his really good throws into really great throws. But there's going to be a time when the pressure gets to him. There's going to be a time when he can't execute a 2-minute drill. Oh, Goff has more command of the offense? Fantastic. That's going to happen sometimes where he's got the ability to come out to his lead and they've got the ability to run the ball. But guess what? The Vikings were still the best team in the league at stopping the run, which is all the Lions are, and they've been able to stop every other offense in the NFL. And Brian Flores has already shown an ability to innovate in the middle of the season. They had the 5th worst defense in the NFL after 3 weeks, and he decided to install a completely new offense without the ability to have an offseason to give any of these players an idea of what that defense was going to be. Installed a completely new defense and turned into the best defense on duct tape and gum with no players in the secondary. Turns in the best defense from weeks 4 to week 13 until somebody who's not the Raiders was able to take a look at the film and read a Kevin Seifert article and understand what was really going on and take it apart. That's going to happen sometimes. You're going to lose by 2 points against a really good team. But yeah, the Lions have had 3 attempts against this defense. Now the Vikings have had 3 attempts against that offense. And the Vikings have been doing better against that offense every single time. The idea that you can collapse after going 5-1, the Vikings are still probably the best team in the conference because they have got a better set of tackles than any other team in the NFL. They've got the best receiver in the NFL who's continuing to perform at a really high level. Right now, he ranks 3rd in receiving yards per game, and no one is talking about him. When you add in those penalty yards, he's number 1 in the NFL. No one is talking about Justin Jefferson. That's crazy, and maybe because he has the best supporting cast of receivers that he's ever had with him, with Jordan Addison getting 66 and Jalen Naylor getting 76. These are a phenomenal group of 3. They might be the best wide receivers 1 through 3 in the NFL. And yeah, that includes the Bengals, that includes the Dolphins, that includes the Eagles. It doesn't matter. These are really phenomenal receivers behind an offensive line anchored by the 2 best tackles in the NFL. And Sam Darnold, a first-round pick, mind you, that was not given enough time to develop in the Jets, who we just talked about, like they can develop a quarterback. Look what they did to Geno Smith, right? You can trust this Sam Darnold, who's giving you a $50 million performance on $10 million a year, to give you these moments where he's going to thread the needle and give you an outstanding throw to get you an outstanding catch at the end of a game. And people have worried about his ability to come back at the end of games, but the thing that you need is improvisational capability, the ability to handle pressure, understand situational awareness, and he has demonstrated that time and again in a way that Kirk Cousins couldn't for the first 8 years of his career, and that Jared Goff couldn't for almost his entire career. Now, remember when the Lions had a 2-minute drill against the 49ers? They collapsed. The Vikings don't feel like that team at all. And the fact that they can only get better with an entirely new group of players, I mean, they have like 8 new players on defense. The idea that they were going to be a complete defense after installing an entirely new system that no one in the NFL has ever installed before is asinine. Of course, they're going to have a couple of stumbling blocks, and you'd rather have them now than have them later. The team wasn't going to go undefeated. No team in the modern NFL is really going to go undefeated unless it's that crazy 2007 Patriots team, which guess what? That was 17 years ago. No team's going to go undefeated. You're going to have some losses, and I'd rather have a loss to a good Lions team that you can learn something from than a bad loss to a team that you can't learn anything from except don't make mistakes. The Vikings have survived worse games from their quarterback with an excellent unit. They just didn't get the bounce of the ball this time. They're a fantastic team.
And that is your one Arif Debates Arif for the year. Hope you guys enjoyed it. You may need a cigarette after that, and I am partially talking to Arif here.
I'm good.
Well, let's go to the second question, which is Brian Jellerson asking, was it more offensive scheme or talent on the Lions that got us on defense? Is it something that could be relatively replicable by other teams?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, the Packers actually did a pretty decent job of it too, and obviously they've got a completely different group of receivers. It's like a bunch of wide receiver twos. That's how people have been describing the Packers for 2 years now, and I think it's accurate. Whereas the Lions have obviously Amon-Ra, and then I guess Jameson Williams didn't do anything in this game, but like they've got a different type of talent, and they were still able to execute on a lot of the same concepts that were really effective against the Vikings. So I do think that offenses will pick up on some of the tendencies that both the Lions and the Packers demonstrated. And the thing that's kind of concerning is that the Jets didn't take that approach at all, and they still in the second half were able to march down the field. A bunch of short passes, yak dependent throws and stuff like that really took advantage of how the Vikings were playing these kind of underneaths. If you combine them, you've got a really full-fledged plan to take on this offense or take on this defense that you're going to have to watch out for and build around. But the thing, and I mentioned this in the debates section, the thing is that Flores is a pretty adaptable kind of defensive coordinator. He's going to kind of understand, like, well, this is kind of the things that you exploited about the defense. And he's going to have to kind of implement some new ideas. It wouldn't shock me if there was kind of a planned evolution of what this defense was supposed to be from the beginning of the season to the end of the season to into the postseason, where a lot of these things would change on a kind of a schedule. And maybe he's going to have to accelerate that schedule a little bit. But the idea that, like, he doesn't understand that quarters beats this defense, that dagger beats this quarters defense, I think is basically insulting. I think he knows. It's not to say that, like, the pieces that are, like Luke's piece, that are raising the alarm bells about this particular problem are wrong. They're not. But I think that this is something that he's going to be aware of. So that's something to kind of figure out. Like, he's aware of it, probably, almost certainly. How he's going to approach that, that's going to be interesting, because one of the problems that Luke identifies in this piece is that the Vikings don't really have the horses to run cover 3, which is a really good response to this, or cover 1, which is a really good response to this. And so you're going to have to find out some other solutions to kind of get around that. But the Lions were a more talented team, which is why their approach worked in the way that the Packers didn't quite work to the same degree of effectiveness, because they're less talented. Both very talented teams, but the Packers less talented. So with that in mind, I think it was a combination of losing the chess match, from scheme to scheme, play to play, and also that the Lions kind of just had players that were able to fulfill that. Because I think that if you don't have a receiver as good as Amon-Ra, the routes that he's running are probably not going to be as effective against people like Stephon Gilmore. So I think you probably needed both. And plus, they have the best offensive line in the NFL. Like, if the issue is you'll give up dagger because you'll blitz them and have the quarterback on his back by the time he sees that guy open, then you probably need a good offensive line to counter that, and the Lions have the best one. So, I think that it's all of those kind of coalesce to create this problem.
Zen Cupid asks, how is it determined when to use replay assistant versus forcing a team to use a challenge?
Yeah, so the NFL implemented this replay assistant thing in 2021 and updated it in 2024. And the idea was that it kind of sucks that coaches were wasting challenges on some of the most obvious stuff that we could see, on stuff like, clock management, like, oh, they've got the wrong time on the clock, or on stuff like, hey, you've got the wrong down and distance up there. Some of the more obvious sideline catches, which we saw this weekend, being kind of overturned by the replay assistant. Like, if it's really obvious and the broadcast sees it, it kind of sucks that a coach has to evaluate a replay when there's people in New York that see it and know what the correct call is. So it has to be obvious, and it has to be on video, and it's either administrative, like correct down and distance game clock, or it has to be something that is considered objective by the NFL. So completion and completion on the sideline, but not what isn't a catch, if that makes sense, right? If a catch survives the ground, that's a judgment call. Pass interference is a judgment call. Roughing the passer, they clarified in 2024, is not considered a judgment evaluation by a ref, but it has an objective set of rules, which I think really calls into question and really highlights how kind of stupid the subjective objective divide is for some of these. But roughing the passer is objective, and pass interference is subjective. The sideline completion is objective. The catch is subjective. Whatever it is, it has to be objective, and it has to be obvious on the video. And that's when they will say, "Hey, you don't need to challenge. We'll just do it." So that's kind of the thing. And I'll link something in the show notes that has a little bit more explanation of that.
Nick the Greek asks, I have a long-standing theory that TJ Hawkinson doesn't like playing football that much and lacks killer instinct, as evidenced by a number of red zone and contested catch drops throughout his career. Do you think his absence from the Detroit game was due to his lack of football chutzpah? Was he afraid that Kirby Joseph would deliberately attempt to explode his knee again? Can Arif calculate TJ's clutchness score and distill it down to a number for me?
Okay, so Nick the Greek is a Lions fan who listens to the show pretty regularly, I will say, and also is a subscriber. Thank you, Nick, to Wide Left. But Lions fans are very weird about TJ Hawkinson. So his career contested catch win rate is like 57%, which is above the NFL average of like 42%. It's good. He's got a good contested catch rate. There are some moments where I've tweeted out that he lost his contested catch or that he had a drop in the red zone or in the end zone even, where I've had Lions fans being like, yep, I've seen that before. And the problem is a lot of these moments stick out, but they're not very numerous and not supported by kind of a bunch of data. Like if you make a bunch of catches in the red zone and then you have a crucial drop, people are going to remember the drop more than the number of catches. So if you've got 5 catches in the red zone and 1 drop, people are going to remember you as the guy who dropped in the red zone. If you have 12 catches in the red zone and 1 drop, people are going to remember the same thing. It's not until you like really build up that number before people are like, well, it's pretty rare that happens. And that's kind of what's happening to Hawkinson. So his drop rate at 5.4% over his career is better than the league average at the position. When you only take a look at drop rates in the red zone, it's even lower at 3.5%. Now, there was a really notable drop in a Vikings uniform against the Buccaneers last year that turned into an interception for Kirk Cousins. And it really undercut the argument that Kirk Cousins was having like an MVP 8-game stretch before he got injured, because there were a couple of interceptions that he threw that were not interception-worthy throws or interceptable passes. One of them was a perfectly thrown ball. Perfectly is maybe the wrong. People had discussions about how perfectly thrown it was. I thought it was a really well-thrown pass, low to TJ Hawkinson, that he bumped up into a pick. And I had a couple of Lions fans tweet at me that this is something that they're familiar with happening. And you take a look at the sheer number of targets he's had in tight spaces in the low red zone, and the total number of drops and contested catch losses he's had, and it's not many. So this actually isn't a thing. You could just remember the ones that disappointed you the most. So that's what's really happened. Oh, and he also had 1 year where his drop rate was really high, but the other 3 years in a Lions uniform, it was fairly low, and people just kind of remember the 1 year where he had like an 11% drop rate.
Our next question is from Max, who asks, how many more third downs do the Vikings convert with Hawkinson if he's in the game? And how big of an impact will he have when he comes back? Also, side note, how long before Jordy Nelson comes out of retirement to play for the Jets?
One more Aaron Rodgers
One more friend.
So you have to take into account like the substitution effect here. So Hawkinson probably catches 3 or 4 third downs in this game for first downs. My guess is that in that scenario, so I've already made up a number and I've said probably, I've got no basis for it, but that's my guess. You catch 3 or 4. That's probably pretty high, but 3 or 4 third downs that get converted into first downs. Okay, great. 2 of those he's probably taking away from somebody who caught some third downs for first downs in this game. So you've got a substitution effect. So I think the ultimate net effect is probably 2 more third downs converted into first down, plus obviously a couple of other catches here and there. But it was a 2-point game that came down to the final 15 seconds. I think a couple more third down conversions would have won the game for the Vikings. Like, I think that would have been enough, right? Because it was within inches. And mind you, the 15-second thing isn't a completely fair calculation because the Lions were playing around with the clock at the end. So it wasn't as close as 15 seconds implies, certainly. But I think a couple more first downs, the Vikings would have won the game. So yeah, Hawkinson being fully available probably is the difference.
Room Bull Sharif asks, my throat is not hoarse after attending the game at US Bank Stadium. Did I not yell loud enough, and am I to blame for the loss?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, that. I think we both agree on that. Roro asks, as we have good cap and poor draft capital next year, do you see any opportunities for cap dump trades this year?
This year, I don't really see that as likely. So this is probably like in the vein of it could be kind of like the most extreme version is the Goff Stafford trade, right? Where the Rams get to offload Goff and his contract and then pay the privilege of 2 first-round picks to get Matthew Stafford. So obviously they saw Stafford as an upgrade over Goff. Obviously his contract wasn't, perfect or anything like that, but there was, I think, a cap difference that favored the Rams, favored the Lions after the trade. And so the Rams took on an additional cost of additional picks. So that's an extreme example. The purest example, I think, is the Brock Osweiler trade where the Browns took on Brock Osweiler's contract and for that received a second-round pick and traded away something like a 6th, if I remember. From the Texans, if I remember correctly. So they took on his contract and took on the cap hit, and they turned that into picks, which I think was a really phenomenal move, and I'm surprised it didn't happen more often after that. I don't think that's going to happen with the Vikings. First, I think that they have plans for their cap, either like emergency or something else. But it would be nice to see them acquire a couple of extra picks. And if they could, acquire players in a trade for the purposes of doing that, that would be nice. But I just don't see them doing that. I don't feel like they, as much as we like talk about Kwesi being an analytics GM and being a finance guy and seeing all these things as assets and contracts as liabilities that you balance on a sheet and maybe can trade to get some assets. And he doesn't really act like that all that often. He more is an opportunity seeker in terms of overlooked talent, whether that's because of injury or something else. That's like more his game. I would love to be proven wrong, though. I don't think that's going to happen.
Next question is from Arif Luenza, who asks, for Arif's drafting a kicker corner, when does Will Reichard end up being worth the draft pick?
I mean, the problem is Blair Walsh had one of the best rookie kicker seasons of all time. This is not to say Will Reichard will turn into Blair Walsh. It's more to say we can't use one season to tell us that a guy is good if it's like at the kicker position where you only get like 40 to 60 opportunities or whatever it is. We're going to need a couple of seasons. And so I would say probably 3 actually. Before we get a good understanding of how good he is. I maybe would have 100% changed my answer completely if the Vikings trotted him out for a 71-yard kick and he made it. I probably would have been like, yeah, I don't need to see anything else. I'm good. But I think we probably need to wait a little bit just because, and maybe I use a traumatizing example with Blair Walsh, but we've seen this before where kickers have, one good year and then the 2 years or 3 years surrounding it or after it are just not there. So, not yet, but certainly the Vikings are right now on a path to being more likely to be right about this than I am. So, good for them.
Let's go to Cam X Storm now that the podcast is going off the rails. For the occult corner, as acclaimed occult podcasters, why am I involved in this? If you were Kevin O'Connell and wanted to recapture some of the demonic forces / energies that propelled the team in 2022, how would you go about doing it? Does the proximity to Halloween make this process easier?
Yeah, so the veil between worlds collapses a little bit on All Hallows Eve, and that's a product of Saints Day, the very next day, which is why you have Halloween. So yeah, a lot of these energies are going to be moving with a lot more fluidity and force and power, which does mean you need to be more careful about it, but they are more accessible. But there's a higher likelihood of, mistakes turning bad or even making mistakes in the first place. So that's something you got to worry about. But, if they wanted to capture something, I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea. Probably the way to go about it is to, I think, so in 2022, a lot of it was designed around cursing other teams so that the quarterbacks wouldn't be available for that game. It worked out really well. Outstandingly well, actually. The run of backup quarterbacks the Vikings faced that year was obscene. But I think here you probably have to have a different approach. And I think a lot of it is in kind of like luck related magics, as it were. Recovering fumbles, forcing fumbles on strip sacks. Goff fumbled the ball, I want to say twice on sacks and recovered it both times. Now, if you had made a pact with the demon, you could have ensured that the ball slipped out and increased your chances of recovering that. So I think that that's probably where it goes. I think it's like a lot of these 50-50 things turn into 60-40 or 70-30. And that's really going to change the game for you in much more subtle ways than I think, honestly, if I were to evaluate it, with this kind of hindsight, crude attempt at just injuring players and getting the backup in. Like, I think that's like, beginner's guide to demonic magic, honestly. And the Vikings have grown as an organization, and maybe they can approach it with a little bit more subtlety.
Depressed podcaster James Pagashnik asks,
hey, that's you.
Which is not me, but an account that has taken my Twitter my Twitter profile picture and aged it in a filter to the point where I am not happy with it. That is... It looks. Oh, is it? Do depictions of you that seem distorted in some way upset you when they're tweeted at you or something like that, James? Is that something I would bother a normal person? Do you think? I thought you could. You didn't need to age me 15 years. I think you could have just aged me 5, and it would have been fine. You didn't need to put me in a sailor uniform, okay? How did I put you in a sailor uniform? I'm not you generally, with the royal you. I was gonna say, when did I put you in a sailor uniform? I mean, okay, if you want to talk about your culpability, you definitely encourage this. Like, let's not pretend you didn't encourage this, but also initially it wasn't even about you. It was just like a you generally, right? But now that you've brought up your culpability here, I think egging on this pervert fan artist who we've hired repeatedly, and giving him money repeatedly, even when we don't hire him, we just give him money sometimes. I don't really understand it. I just think you're culpable here a little bit. So what I'm trying to say here, James, is I already had no sympathy going in. It'd be like if I complained about like the TSA patting me down aggressively as a black person is getting frisked by the police, right? It's just like not the forum. Okay. You're telling me I need to read the room a little bit better? Yeah. Yeah, I think so, James. I disagree. I feel like my depictions... This is not what I signed up for. You knew what you were signing up for. I feel like what do you mean I knew what I was signing up for me. Who signed up for that? This is not fair for James. This is still fair for Arif. So, along these lines, depressed podcaster James Pagashnik asks, what's the best music to listen to after a Vikings loss, but before a Vikings podcast? Boy, Jimmy Eat World's The Middle, maybe. That's good. I like that a lot. That's really good. I was trying to figure out, like, because I saw Depressed. That's in the name, right? I saw Depressed, and I was like, oh, depressing music. And my mind went to immediately way more depressing music than is necessary for the situation. It was like Snow Patrol. I'm shocked. Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, you got Snow Patrol still in my head from our discussion in pre-show. The show. You are... Yeah, I have no sympathy. Thanks. So instead of Snow Patrol, what did you come up with? Instead of chasing cars, I wanted something that was both like it had sad moments, but it also had upbeat moments. It got you ready. And I think, obviously, I like Third Eye Blind a lot, and they've got a bunch of stuff that is like upbeat sounding. I think that of the 3 Third Eye Blind albums that comprise like their golden era, right, that people like a lot, I have like the reverse opinion of like the way these albums have been rated. Of the 3, I think like Self-Titled is like the least good, and then Blue is the next best, and then Out of the Vein is my favorite. That's just my take. I think a lot of people disagree with it, and that's fair. But I was going to go with Out of the Vein, but it just didn't feel right. I think the Blue album is perfect here. But just don't listen to Slow Motion, because at that point you're hitting Snow Patrol levels of like sad and depressing. So that's near the end of the album, if not the end of the album. So just skip it. But the rest, it's like you've got some pretty sad stuff, but you've got some like pretty upbeat stuff. You got stuff like Wounded, which don't listen to the lyrics too closely and you'll start relating to them. It's great. So I think that's perfect. But then you've got like some of the guitar to amp you up, and then listen to this podcast, and then you can be sad again, and then you can play Coldplay because you got really sad because you listened to our podcast. I'm shocked you said Coldplay at the end of it and not the Garden State soundtrack. I feel like that's the next logical step for you personally. Well, yeah, I wouldn't be listening to Coldplay. I would be listening to like Death Cab and the Shins. But you know, you do you. Logan asks, question for Reef's caffeine addiction corner. You drink a lot of caffeine. I am hoping to replace my coffee cups 2 and or 3 with something that is ideally providing equivalent caffeine, 2-ounce ratio as coffee, not a sugar bomb, and does not include a sugar substitute like stevia, sucralose, anything like that, because those just taste awful and I can't stomach them.
It's interesting because I actually can only stomach them in energy drinks. I really dislike them as sugar substitutes when people are baking, even if you account for like the chemical changes that are a little bit different. And I hate it in like pop. I've not had like a diet pop that I like. And I just can't, except energy drinks. So for whatever reason, that works for me. Obviously, that can't be true of everybody. So I tried thinking about this, and I think that you can go in the direction of, so there's like these like health conscious organic energy drinks. You have to be really careful about them. Some of the ones that are like organic and health conscious that they present are also really high in sugar. Like there was one that I found that was like supposed to be healthy for you, and I read the back, and the sugar was like 23 grams of sugar. And it's like, okay, for one drink, that's a little bit too much if your hope is to cut down on sugar. It's not like Coke levels of sugar, I think. But like Red Bull has like 27 grams of sugar, right? Like I think that we're probably not in the right range. So I was looking around, and I did have some energy seltzers that were like pretty good for a seltzer, which I don't like. So good for a seltzer means I didn't hate it, I think. And Highball and True North are 2 energy drinks that are sold as seltzers that don't have any sweeteners or have very light amounts of sweetener in them. And the sweetening is usually coming in the form of a flavoring agent to make it taste like black cherry rather than in the form of like a sugar, which I think technically flavoring agents are sugars, but I think you get what I mean, right? It's not like glucose or fructose or stevia or erythritol or whatever it is. So that's probably the answer here, but I don't have a ton of experience. But the direction you probably want to go in is stuff marketed as natural, and then like read the label to see if you've got the sugar and sugar substitute. That's probably going to narrow it down a little bit better for you.
Kenneth Allen asks, for a Reef's Divine Justice Corner, Deshaun Watson received divine retribution this week for his many crimes, proving that God must exist. Given this, what does the Vikings' loss imply about the Vikings fans? What have we done to anger him so?
Okay, so first of all, I think that the existence of a God does not suggest the existence of an interventionist God, first of all. Second, I don't think that someone receiving divine justice is actually evidence of there being a divine justice. It's just our perception of it. Mind you, a lot of people are very glad at what happened with Deshaun Watson because of the fact that he's a bad person. Like, that makes sense to me. I'm not going to give you an opinion on whether or not I think a player deserved to be injured, but I'm going to say that if a player did deserve to be injured, he's on a very short list. But also, we just saw 2 players who definitely did not deserve to be injured get injured. So that seems like it's random, and it just happened to hit the right, spot on the dartboard, right? So I don't think that, but also I just feel like if we are going to accept these premises, that God must exist, that God intervenes to form some sort of divine retributive pact, I think it's cheering for a team that does dark magic. I feel like that's pretty clear.
Yeah, that would make sense. Football's Misandrous Niche asks, for a Reef's top 50 receivers corner, by denying St. Brown's talent, you have clearly evoked the wrath of Ra upon his son Chariot, as he has used his power to hurt the Vikings and bless their enemies. Are you willing to bend the knee to the sun, or have you another method to defy this curse?
Does the Egyptian version of the sun god have a chariot? Like, I know the Greek version does. Like, Helios has a chariot, but does Ra? I don't think Ra has a chariot. I think it's just like on his head, right? Anyway, okay. First of all, I never lied. I do think Amon-Ra St. Brown is a top 500 receiver. Like, prove me wrong. Of course he's in the top 500. It's a ridiculous thing. Other people are disrespecting him, not me, when they suggest that my characterization is incorrect. Are you saying he's the 501st best receiver in the NFL? I hardly think he'd be starting if that were the case. That's crazy. This all stems from 3 years ago. I think Jeremy Reisman said that Amon-Ra St. Brown's a top 15 receiver. And I was like, hold on. no way. And I challenged him to name the 15, and then I named a couple of others that I thought were better. And he didn't love that exercise, but I think I came away correct on it. And so I've just been making that joke the whole time. And now that Amon-Ra has gone to, or has earned all-pro recognition, and is probably one of the more underrated, highly talented receivers, now Lions fans are calling him a top 10 receiver in the league. And I honestly still have a little bit of trouble with it. I feel like we can name more than 10, but I didn't want to continue the same form of that joke every single time we had him on the podcast. And so I'm trying other ways to get at a callback to the joke without doing the same process of listing the receivers every single day. This is boring. So I called him a top 500 and a top 50 and a top 100 receiver. But yeah, I think no, I'm gonna keep doing versions of this bit. I'm gonna keep disrespecting this guy.
Yeah. Skimbleshanks the Railway Cat asks, if Minnesota and Detroit combined forces to become the Lion Viking, would they go undefeated? No. Related, can James sing the beginning of the song The Circle of Life? Correct pronunciation is a must. No. Luke Bentz asks, for Reeves League Commissioner's Attire Corner, given that the WNBA Commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, was able to wear the New York City skyline to the finals, which Taylor Swift-era costume will Roger Goodell attend the Super Bowl in? All right, if you tuned in to listen to his WNBA rant, which 6 of you did, you are in for a treat. Arif, was it a travel? It looked like a travel, but I don't know if
it was rigged from the beginning, James.
I don't know if it was a foul.
Rigged from the beginning.
I mean,
the idea.
Really? I'm not sure if it was. I don't.
Okay, clearly a travel, not even close to a travel. The fact that it didn't even show up on review is insane to me. And the things they let Jonquel Jones get away with, and it is a kind of a difficult conversation to have because, Jones has made this point really, really well before in the past about how people make assumptions about her because of her size and her skin color. Totally fair. But they let her in this specific series. She's one of the best players in the league. Let her in this specific series. She's actually the best player on the Liberty. It's not Brianna Stewart. It's not Sabrina Ionescu. Sorry, that's just what it is. They let her get away with felony assault all 5 games, and they called one offensive penalty on her or foul. It was incredible what they let her get away with. The idea that a team can have one of their best shot chuckers go 1 for 19 and they win a game without any intervention is crazy to me. The fouls that they called on the links instead of it's brutal to me. And you would see instances where Fee is going up for a shot and her arm is just getting absolutely mauled. But it doesn't even have to be by John. It could have been by anybody, right? Going up for a shot, no call. But then she gets called for an over the back. I can't believe the refereeing in that game. And it was just so one-sided. The number of free throws that, by the way, they bricked a number of them because they were not the better team in that series. The number of free throws that they bricked in those final 3 games of the series, I just cannot believe how many times they got to the line. When you compare it to the Liberty's foul rate throughout the rest of the season, or the Liberty's take foul rate throughout the rest of the season, they don't get a bunch of James Harden fourth shots. That's not who they are, right? It is crazy the amount of times they went to the line. You look at the amount of times the Lynx committed penalties throughout the regular season and even throughout the playoffs, and you look at this game. You take a look at the number of times the Liberty took on penalties for extra shots and then compare it to this guy. It just outstanding how biased it was. In fact, actually, the entire fourth quarter of Game 4, the Liberty were not called for a single foul until the very end, when it was just too obvious to ignore. Fourth quarter, no team fouls. Fourth quarter, 0 team fouls. I have never seen that in my life. That's crazy. And then at the ceremony to present this Mickey Mouse trophy, you've got the commissioner of the WNBA wearing a skyline of the city that won. I cannot believe that. That is insane. And then the WNBA account tweets out where it belongs. Okay. So basketball leagues are uniquely vulnerable, I think, to accusations of corruption, probably because they're more corrupt, if I'm being honest.
Well,
but
and the history involving Tim Donaghy doesn't help.
Right. And the, I think, somewhat substantiated rumors about how Patrick Ewing got to New York in the first place. I think there's just a lot going on here, right? And the WNBA has had these conspiracies thrown about them this year about different organizations, about ways they've manipulated things. And I'm definitely an anti-conspiracy guy. You hear me on the Minnesota Football Party push back against Sam's conspiracies all the time. I hate it when people talk about like penalty disparities and ref disparities in NFL games. And I think that that's valid. And I think it's even true in most NBA games that people are just not really thinking about this correctly. But it is difficult to ignore in the WNBA. But like, it just seemed like, and they also had like Liberty announcers the whole time. Like, and by that, I mean, they never talked about the links. Nafisa Collier was the best player on the court. Like for 5 games. Now, I'm not saying she had the best performance out of all 5 games, although I think she did. But like in terms of how they performed throughout the regular season and in the postseason, Fee was the best player. There was only one player that played better than Fee all year. It was Asia Wilson. She plays for the Aces. She wasn't in that game. Fee was the best. They never talked about her, especially in Game 5. They never talked about her. They were talking about Bree. They were talking about Sabrina. I was losing. They had a former Liberty teammate on the call. It was crazy how biased the coverage was, how rigged the game was called, how much they had manufactured this narrative about New York. Oh my God, New York has never won. Like, I don't care if New York has never won. What about the 5-peat the Lynx should have gone on? This sucks. And the thing is, like, you understand what the motivation is for something like rigging a game like this. And it's still stupid. Like, yeah, okay, you gave the biggest market in the United States a championship and a reason to like be continuously invested in the franchise. Sure, fine, whatever. It does not, like, you know, especially in the modern environment, but I think just generally speaking, it does not matter whether or not the biggest market, like the biggest WNBA market is Indiana, which is one of the smaller cities in terms of media markets. It's because all of this is national. People are following Angel Reese not because they're cheering for Chicago. It's because they're following Angel Reese. People are following Caitlin Clark because it's Caitlin Clark, right? Like, these aren't, like, it shouldn't be about regional marketing. And the integrity of the game is going to matter way more to your long-term returns than anything about like the biggest media market winning or anything like that. That's insane. So they got absolutely jobbed in a way that we haven't seen from the NBA since the 90s. Like, we don't need to repeat the whole growth arc for the WNBA. We could skip some of the bad parts of the NBA. We don't have to have that part. We just have the good parts. But no. It is impossible you can't wear the clothing of one of the cities that's competing. I don't care if it's because that's where the trophy ceremony is happening or you're just celebrating New York. I don't care. It is insane that doesn't even seem like an impropriety to you, that it didn't cross your mind that would look bad, and that whoever is running socials for the WNBA didn't think it would look insane to say it's where it belongs. Can you imagine an NFL team doing that? The NFL saying this is where it belongs as the New York Giants pull off an insane upset against the Kansas City Chiefs or whatever? No one would be okay with that. So why should they be okay with this? I can't believe it. And okay, here's another thing. WNBA refs have been bad all year. They might be the worst refs in all of professional sports. I have watched people ref the Women's Hockey League, the women's soccer. I've watched the NBA refs who are notoriously bad. I've seen this bad umpire stuff happen, and it seems like umpires are actually getting worse in baseball. I have seen this bad ref turnover in the NFL, right? That they had a bunch of refs retire over the past 3 years, and now we've got some pretty poor refs, relatively speaking. And it is not close. NFL refereeing is so much better than WNBA refereeing. It's so bad, even without the rigging. They have to fix it. They have to. It's outrageous what they're doing. So that's my take. Fee rules. The Lynx should have a 5th title. They shouldn't have played Alana Smith as much as they did in game 4 and 5. She was clearly hurt. They should have played Dorka. I can't believe that they didn't play Dorka more, especially in game 4. They could have won that game. Nadisha Heidemann has so much energy. Probably shouldn't be taking some of the shots she should, but that's the part of the bargain. Courtney Williams was insane, outstanding, incredible through the entire postseason until game 5. Pretty bad game 5. I don't want to blame her too much for it. Kayla McBride hitting all of those shots. Holy crap, Kayla was so good. If it wasn't Fee being the best on the court with the series, it was Kayla. Incredible. I've only seen her in person go cold, and I've seen her numbers be extraordinary throughout the season, and it was finally awesome to see her in person play outstanding, incredible basketball. Bridget Carlton, if you want my number, you should just email the show at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. I find you very attractive.
And on that bombshell, we will end this episode. Arif, other than your email address, what would you like to plug this week?
Well, it was your email. It was the podcast email address.
Oh,
I want to conduct this through official channels.
Yes, but you are subscribed to whatever. I'm not going to get into the logistics. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, so you can find my stuff over at wildleft.football. That's all the written stuff. That's going to be Luke's pieces, my post-game reaction piece, where I rewatched the offense and the defense and wrote a bunch of words about it. I also wrote 7,000 words about the Vikings offense after watching all of the snaps again. So that's over at wildleft.football. A lot of content this week. Hopefully I'll get another piece out. It's going to be tough because of the shortened schedule for the Vikings, but I think I've got a plan to get some stuff published, at least by Monday of next week, that I think is going to be pretty big and pretty good. So head over there. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at Arif and NFL. And then my other podcasts are 60 Minute Drill and the Minnesota Football Party.
So the plan for this week is going to be to have the interview posted on Wednesday morning. So the interview portion of the episode that we typically do on Thursdays. So for the preview for that will be put out on Wednesday morning. So you'll get access to that. Likely be recording the post game shortly after the game, but we'll talk. So, but at the moment, that is what the plan is for the rest of the week. So you enjoy that. And for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And just remember that fat cats get slaughtered. And we will be back in just a couple days. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of... And he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or at my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merch. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
All things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.